Hey, everybody, it's Jonathan Cohn at the Bulwark. We are going to talk about trade today. So much has been happening, new agreements with Japan, with the EU. We've got the August 1st deadline. Our guest today is Jason Furman, professor of economics at Harvard University, also served in the Obama administration, one of the smartest economists I know. I'm so happy to have Jason here. Before we jump into it, if you like what we're doing here at the Bulwark, please follow us on YouTube, subscribe to our feed, subscribe to our newsletters. Check us out online. Jason, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be with you, especially with those kind words.
So let's just jump into this. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners, readers, they've sort of followed the trade story, but there's been so much happening. I mean, Trump came in, he said he was having these big tariffs, then he pulled them back, and he said he's making agreements with this country and that country. It's quite hard to actually keep up with what's going on. Can you just set the stage for us? Relative to where we started, where are we now on trade? What is our posture? How has it changed since Trump took office?
Yeah. So prior to Trump taking office, the average tariff we had on other countries was 3%. Obviously some things higher, some things came in with no tariff at all. It averaged about 3%. Right now, we're collecting tariffs of about 20% on all imports. How did we get from 3% to 20%? First of all, there is a 10% tariff on almost every country in the world. I say almost because it does not include Russia, Belarus, and North Korea. That's a whole other story. We don't import a lot from them either, but
right.
The symbolism is a little odd to me. Anyway,
an interesting collection of countries. Yes, an interesting. Go ahead.
10% on every country in the world, and now we're going country by country and reaching agreements that we will have a tariff rate generally above 10%. It's 10% for the UK, 15% for Europe, 19% for Vietnam. It just depends on the country that's higher. In addition, we also have separate tariffs on things like steel and more potentially in the works. But basically, the bottom line is it looks like we're settling in at sort of roughly on average a 20% tariff on things coming into the United States, ranging from 10 to 50, depending on the country and the item.
And just put that in historical context. I mean, is that a lot? Is that a little? I mean, what is that? Is 20% a lot?
That is a lot. You have to go back to the 1930s to find tariffs at that rate. We raised tariffs a lot in the 1930s with Smoot-Hawley. It contributed to the Great Depression back then, but frankly, all economists always knew that was, probably one of the smaller contributors, definitely a negative, but not the cause of the Great Depression, more caused by the Great Depression, leading countries to lash out against each other. So raised tariffs a lot back in the 1930s. And then we basically spent the next 75 years lowering those tariffs steadily through global agreements, through one-on-one agreements with different countries. That process basically started to reverse in 2018 with Trump's first term, the first time he raised tariffs, and then just massive reversal of it now.
Now, there were some tariffs in the Biden administration, right? I mean, I remember I followed the auto industry pretty closely. We had some auto industry tariffs and such, but those were different in nature? Or?
Yeah, I mean, Biden had criticized Trump's China tariffs. He then ended up keeping all of them and adding to them, including for things like electric vehicles. Right. But again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's say the average tariff rate was something like 2% before Trump's first term. But with everything Trump did in his first term and everything Biden did, it went to 3%. Now it's gone from 3 to 20. And those numbers might be a little bit off. It might have gone from 2.5 to 3. I'm not sure, but it's about a percentage point move before. It's about a 17 percentage point move just in the last few months. So that's
completely
pretty different scale.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, so we got these two agreements in the last week, right? We got Japan, we got the EU, two of our biggest trading partners. Do we know? First of all, they were announced, but we've all learned, right, with the Trump administration, the fact that it was announced, even if it was announced by a government official, doesn't necessarily mean it happened, or we know that. Are these agreements actually? Do we know the details, or do we know just in the broad shape? Are we? What do we know?
Right. They're definitely, and you saw this with Vietnam as well, where the different parties to the agreement had a different understanding. One went out and said, we agreed to blank, and the other's like, no, I thought we actually didn't tell you. that we would do blank. So we've seen that with all of these economies. There's also the agreements include Europe buying a lot more energy from the United States and Japan investing a lot more in the United States. But European governments don't buy that energy, and the Japanese government doesn't allocate, that investment. That's the private sector in both of those economies. So how exactly you make a deal, an agreement, and enforce things that the private sector will do is a little bit murky. So these are not remotely written out, formalized, everything locked in. That being said, I think the different sides are motivated enough that while they could fall apart as they, put it down in, pencil and paper and have a document that can be signed, my best guess now is, that they muddle through and figure out how to paper over all the different understandings.
Yeah, so it seems like, and tell me if I got getting this wrong, but it seems like with both the European and the Japanese agreement, the basic shape of it is they agreed to tariffs on most of their exports, and then there's a certain categories of goods that are carved out here and there. There is, as you said, and I think in both cases, right, there's this promise to purchase something from the United States, although it's not clear, as you just said, who's doing that purchasing. And the U.S. doesn't seem like it has to give up a lot in this. There's not new tariffs on our imports. First of all, do I have that right? Did I sketch that out roughly correctly?
Yes. And I would say two things. One is I am surprised that these countries have been willing to give things to the United States, not in exchange for everything. That is not something that I expected democracies to be capable of doing. I wasn't that surprised with countries like Vietnam that are very asymmetric in their dependence on the United States and where politics doesn't matter as much. But democracies, I was surprised, first of all. Second of all, it's really, really important to understand that the U.S. tariffs on these countries are not just like on these countries. They're, hurting us. So, a lot of the language of like who gives what, who gets what, etc., has built into it almost a false premise. I mean, where these tariffs hurt the United States and they hurt Europe. They hurt the United States and they hurt Japan. In fact, some of the better macro modeling suggests that U.S. growth will be hurt more than growth will be in Europe and Japan. And so even though we're the winners in the negotiation, we could well still end up being the losers economically.
So wait, why would growth in the United States decline more than it would in Europe if theoretically we got, again, the better end of the deal?
Well, if you look at estimates from the Yale Budget Lab, they show that U.S. growth goes down and European growth, they actually think would go up as a result of this. I would put a large error band around their findings, not through any fault of theirs, just because the world's an incredibly complicated place and we don't even know all the details of how all these agreements would work out. But directionally, that the United States would be hurt more, I find quite plausible. Why is that? Well, first of all, a lot of these tariffs are on intermediate inputs that we use to help us make stuff and to create jobs and higher wages and all of that. So it could be on equipment that's used in a manufacturing firm. It could be on the steel that's used by an auto company. And so it can end up hurting a number of different manufacturing industries. Second of all, the United States is going to end this with tariffs on the entire world, whereas the rest of the world is still sort of freer trade. And so we're getting the accumulated harm in some sense of all of that, whereas Europe only has something going on, with us right now. And then the final thing is just the direction of the U.S. economy will be to import a little bit less because of the tariffs. But then there's a strange thing in economics that when you import less, you end up exporting less as well. And roughly keeping about the same trade balance. That's because the trade balance is determined more by macroeconomic factors like how much you save and how much you invest as a country. So I expect this to result in less imports because they're more expensive, but also less exports. And so that means we're just a little bit less of a specialized economy, taking advantage of comparative advantage a little bit less. and lose out on the better export jobs and replace them with jobs making the things we used to import that weren't quite as good as those
So
export
can you
jobs.
give like an illustration of that? So like what kind of jobs are we going to gain, lose? I mean, what does that look like in practice?
I mean, the steel industry, generally it'll be good, but there's some turnover there as some steel plants actually use a lot of imported inputs. So you'll see some steel plants losing jobs, some steel plants gaining jobs. And by the way, that's a really important factor here. Is one of the problems with the China shock was it just increased the number of winners and the number of losers, and that type
China
of
shock being the sort of China shock
2000.
Yeah.
From 2000, the big import increases from China. And one of the things there wasn't that it sort of did net harm, but that the gross flows became larger. There were big winners, there were big losers, and the US economy didn't handle a lot of that turnover well. So the biggest thing that we're going to have going forward is more turnover. So some steel plants will get built here because, they're protected from competition. But other steel plants that might be part of a supply chain where they're taking some, raw material, foreign steel in and refashioning it into something here, those jobs will go away. Within the auto industry, you're seeing some stuff move back here if it's making things for Americans. But there are other plants, parts or auto plants, that were actually making things for export. And you're not going to want to locate those in the United States. So some plants move here, some plants move away. And so the biggest thing is that this will actually speed, be like a shock to the economy that leads to a lot of reallocation. And that itself can be costly.
So I just want to set expectations a little bit. I feel like when we started the year and Trump first started, talking big on tariffs, we heard a lot of predictions of calamity. Obviously, a lot has happened. He's pulled back on a lot of his threats. We were settling in at a much lower level than he originally said, although, as you pointed out earlier, still much higher than we've had historically. I suspect people are walking around and they're saying, well, yeah, my groceries, maybe they're a little more expensive, but that much more. I mean, it doesn't feel like a catastrophe at the moment. And you were just saying it might not be a catastrophe for a while. What does this potentially look like in a year or two? Or maybe the question is, what should we be watching in a year or two to see what kind of impact the tariffs are having?
Yeah. So, the question a lot of people have right now is, everyone said these tariffs are so terrible, doesn't look so terrible to me. And I think there's three parts of it, some of which you had implicit in your question. One is, we pulled back from the craziest of them. At one point, we had 145% tariffs on China, and we didn't do that. And even the tariff negotiated levels are below where Trump was in April. So one is we've pulled back some. Two is that there are lags. I'm reasonably confident that we're going to see more price increases. Again, let's talk about the auto industry, not just because you're from Michigan. It's important American industry. They were very reluctant to raise prices because the president is staring at them and would get very angry at them. General Motors just reported a big loss for the second quarter. They can't not raise prices forever. So a lot of businesses are sort of waiting a bit to see how long the tariffs will last, try to absorb some of it, wait for the eye of Sauron to be directed elsewhere. But they can't absorb, they can't have literally like sell cars at a loss for the rest of time. And they can't sell cars at a profit without raising their prices to reflect at least some of the tariffs. So I think we're going to get more pass through in the future for a variety of reasons. But then the last part of the answer is something where, the economic models, if you look at what the investment banks and others were saying, they were saying things like this will take a percentage point off growth. Percentage point off growth, most people aren't going to exactly notice it. But then you have to remind yourself that's $2,000 a household. And that's like taking $2,000 and like bring it to the National Mall and lighting it on fire. And the president that ordered everyone to do that would be remembered for the rest of time as one of the dumbest, self-owns in history. But because it happens through GDP and stuff like that, it's not noticed as much. So the bottom line is I do expect some of the issues to grow, especially on the inflation side. But I don't think there's any reason to think they're going to grow to be incredibly noticeable, but that doesn't mean they're not incredibly real.
One more question on trade. I don't know if you have thoughts on this, so feel free to take a pass. But when I look at the countries we've made agreements with and who we haven't made agreements with, two really jump out as big trading partners of us that we haven't made agreement. One is China. In fact, I think I saw, and it crossed my social media feed like literally as I was logging on for this, that I think those talks have now suspended again, or they've broken down. And then India, which is obviously a huge trading partner also. How important are those to our sort of future in trade? I mean, those are two very important countries. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, China, we haven't reached a deal because China has more leverage than any other country in the world vis-a-vis the United States and is willing to use it. We're an important customer for them, but in some ways it's nice to have. They are an input to our manufacturing with things like rare earths that is like a must-have. And so they have quite a lot of leverage. That's why they're the only country that in this whole process you've seen Trump back down on, and why, we haven't been able to dictate terms. India, I'm a little bit less sure. There was so much optimism early on that was going to be one of the very first agreements that would be reached. Both sides really do have a lot of motivation, and I'm less sure why it hasn't happened. I should say, though, on the China thing, though, China is the country in the world where we do have the most legitimate trade issues and trade problems. And, it worries me that we don't have as much leverage as I'd like us to have vis-a-vis China. The way to have that leverage is to get together with others and make our approach to China joint with Japan, Europe, etc. And that's very hard to do the way we've conducted all of this. So I wished we had focused all of this on China and done it together with allies.
Yeah. Well, one last question. I know economists don't like to make firm predictions, but I want to put you on the spot. Very important. We're recording this at it's about 3:30 on Tuesday. We're less than a half hour away from the Major League Baseball trading deadline, so we don't know how that's going to shake out. But what is your prediction? Will the Boston Red Sox make the playoffs?
Wild card, absolutely. 100% certain. No error bends around that one.
Well, folks, you heard it there. Jason, thanks so much for coming on and visiting us at the Bulwark.
Thank you.